It was a quiet night. The kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath, just waiting for something to happen. I had been driving down an empty stretch of road for what felt like hours. The hum of the engine beneath me the only sound. My phone was at 5%, a detail I noted with growing unease. But it didn't feel urgent. I was confident I'd make it home before anything went wrong. How wrong I was. Out of nowhere, the engine sputtered, then fell silent. I pressed my foot on the gas pedal. But nothing happened. The car coasted to a stop. And with a heavy sigh, I turned the key in the ignition. No response. Nothing. My eyes glanced over at the dark, quiet stretch of road around me. No houses. No cars passing by. Just the cold, empty night and me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I knew I had to call for roadside assistance. But there was one problem. My phone was now down to a critical 1%. My heart rate quickened as I realized I could not reach anyone for help. A wave of panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to start the car once more, but it refused to come to life. The steady beat of my heart seemed to sync with the ticking of the clock, a constant reminder of how trapped I really was. In that moment, I looked around. There had to be something. Anything. And then, I saw it. Through the darkness. The dim light of a Walmart parking lot flickered like a lifeline. I could walk there, find a charger, and maybe, just maybe, get a call through. But I couldn't wait too long. The store would close soon. The last thing I needed was to be stranded even longer. The cold air hit me the moment I stepped out of the car. My breath misted in front of me as I began the walk toward the store. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of my situation was pulling me down. I tried not to think about the battery on my phone or how far I still had to go. Walmart wasn't far, but it felt like an eternity. When I finally reached the store, the bright lights were a stark contrast to the dark road I had left behind. It was a strange comfort. The artificial warmth of the place. The aisles, filled with shelves of goods, seemed endless. My mind was still wrapped in the haze of the situation I had just found myself in. But there was something oddly calming about being surrounded by the normality of consumerism. Even if it was late and the store was nearly empty, I headed straight for the electronics aisle. My eyes scanned the shelves, desperately searching for a phone charger. And there it was, hidden between various gadgets and accessories, just what I needed. I was about to pick it up when something caught my eye. A small figure stood a few aisles over, near the baby care section. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing nothing but a tank top and underwear. She was alone in the store. It struck me like a sharp pang in my chest. What on earth was a little girl doing here at this hour? The cold night outside only made her appearance more surreal. Like an abandoned child lost in the haze of a forgotten world. I watched her for a moment, my heart heavy with concern. She didn't seem scared, just lost. She wasn't crying, but her gaze was distant, as if she were trapped in a world no one else could see. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of my own decision. Should I approach her? Would I seem intrusive or strange? What if I couldn't help? After what felt like an eternity, I decided to make my way over to her. I walked carefully, slowly, not wanting to startle her. When I finally reached her, she didn't look up at me right away. Her small, delicate hands were busy, moving carefully over the shelves. I knelt down to her level, trying to make myself less imposing. "Hey there," I said softly. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up at me, but her gaze was guarded. She didn't speak. She simply stared at me with eyes that seemed far older than her years. There was an eerie quiet to her, a stillness that unsettled me. "Are you lost?" I asked gently, crouching down a little lower to get closer to her eye level. She shook her head, but her eyes didn't leave mine. She didn't seem frightened, just wary. Something in that look sent a chill through me, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. The store was empty. The night was getting colder, and here was this tiny person, seemingly without anyone else around her. I stood up and looked around. No one seemed to be paying attention. I made my way to the front of the store, where I saw an employee stocking shelves. His name tag read Jack. I approached him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, I just saw a little girl in the back. Alone. Do you know anything about her?" Jack looked up from the shelves, his face unreadable at first. "Oh, her," he said, nodding casually. "Yeah. She's been here a few times. No one's really done much about it though. She comes in and wanders around. It's not that big of a deal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not that big of a deal? A little girl alone in the store at night wasn't a big deal? My stomach twisted in frustration. But I knew there was more to this story than what Jack was telling me. "I'm going to try to help her," I said firmly. "She shouldn't be here alone." Jack gave a half-hearted shrug, but I could tell he wasn't interested in engaging any further. I turned back toward the girl, heart pounding, as I considered the next step. I still hadn't found a charger, but it no longer mattered. The night had shifted. It wasn't just about getting my phone charged anymore. It was about doing the right thing, helping someone who needed it. Someone who couldn't help themselves. As I walked back toward the baby care aisle, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I couldn't just let this girl be left alone in a place that wasn't meant for her. Not tonight. I found her still by the shelves, her small hands reaching for items on the shelves with an eerie precision. It was as if she had done this before, as though these aisles were more familiar to her than the comforts of a home. A sense of unease settled in my chest as I watched her. Not just because she was alone, but because of the way she moved. It wasn't like a child in need of comfort, it was more like a child accustomed to a world where safety was a foreign concept. I crouched down again, trying to get her attention. "Hey, sweetie. I think you should go find someone. It's really late." She didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on a pack of diapers she was holding in her hands. The motion was so deliberate, so focused. I couldn't help but wonder how many times she had walked these aisles alone, picking up whatever she needed, not asking for help, not bothering anyone. Her silence spoke volumes. It was as if she had learned long ago that trusting others was a dangerous gamble. I cleared my throat. "Can you tell me your name?" She paused, still holding the diapers, and looked at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. "Maya," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. The way she said it sounded almost rehearsed, like she'd had to say it before, to someone who didn't listen, or didn't care. "Maya," I repeated softly, trying to make her feel a bit less isolated. "Where's your mom or dad?" "Maya." She didn't answer, just glanced at me and then looked away, her eyes narrowing, as if the question had no meaning to her. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented story in front of me. A girl this young, alone in the store, without any adult supervision, was a clear sign something wasn't right. I stood up, my feet moving on their own as I looked around the store. No one seemed to be paying attention to us. The shelves were empty of people, and Jack, the employee I had spoken to earlier, was nowhere in sight. It struck me how normal it all seemed to those around us. Maya's quiet presence in the aisle, the indifference of the staff. It was as though no one cared. As though this was just a part of the routine for some people. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Maya," I said gently, "I need to find someone who can help. You shouldn't be here alone." Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I saw something raw and vulnerable, flicker beneath the cool exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She took a small step back, pulling the pack of diapers closer to her chest, as if it were her only shield against the world. I knew I couldn't leave her here. Not like this. My mind flashed to my phone, the power bank I had bought, and the responsibility that now weighed heavily on my shoulders. I had come here for something as trivial as a phone charger. But now I found myself tangled in something far deeper. This little girl, Maya, was not some passing moment in my life. She was a living, breathing call for help. But what could I do for her? I was just a stranger in a Walmart. I had no idea where she came from or what kind of life she was living. Yet here I was, feeling more responsible for her than I had for anyone in a long time. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I made my decision. I would find help. I couldn't just walk away from her. I turned and began searching for Jack, hoping he would finally take this seriously. But when I found him again, it was clear he wasn't going to help much. His apathy was thick, his indifference like a wall I couldn't break through. "Jack," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I really think something's wrong. She's alone. And no one's looking out for her." He shrugged again. His eyes glazed over. "She comes and goes. Doesn't bother anyone. It's not my job to babysit." My blood boiled. How could he be so careless? But I didn't have time to argue with him. Maya needed help, and Jack wasn't going to provide it. I turned back toward the aisles, determined to do what I could. I knelt down once more in front of Maya. "Maya," I said softly, "are you okay? Do you need help?" She looked at me again, those big eyes filled with a sadness that I couldn't ignore. She shook her head slowly, then muttered, "I'm fine. I don't need anyone." But I could hear it, the tiny crack in her voice, the subtle plea buried beneath her words. And at that moment, I knew I had to take responsibility. I couldn't just walk away. She needed someone who would see her, who would truly listen. And maybe, just maybe, someone who could help her find her way out of this cold, lonely place. I straightened up, a new sense of resolve pushing me forward. "I'm going to help you, Maya," I said quietly, "but we need to find your parents." "Okay." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. And that, in its own way, was progress. It was a step toward trusting. Even if it was small. Even if she had been let down by everyone before me. As I looked down at her again, I felt a strange sense of connection. She was just a little girl, no different from any other child. But the circumstances of her life had already shaped her in ways I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just about finding her parents, it was about giving her something that had clearly been missing: care, attention, and the knowledge that someone out there would do anything to make sure she was safe. And so, without another word, I stood tall and started moving through the store, my heart pounding, trying to figure out how to change the course of Maya's story. Because if I didn't help her, who would? I didn't know where to start looking for Maya's parents. But I had to try. There was an unsettling weight in my chest as I guided her through the aisles. I kept glancing around, hoping to see anyone who might know who she was or where she belonged. The store was eerily quiet now. Just the low hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional squeak of shopping carts on the polished floors. It was almost as though the world outside had ceased to exist. And all that was left was this strange little scene unfolding between the shelves. Maya kept close to me, her small figure shadowing my every step. Every now and then, she would glance up at me, her expression unreadable. There was a softness in her eyes now, but it was mingled with wariness, as if she was unsure of my intentions. I couldn't blame her. People had let her down before, but something told me I couldn't turn away. Not now. I had to find someone who could help. My phone was still a lifeline, though the battery was dangerously close to dying. I needed to make a call either to the police or someone who could assist, but it was clear that this situation was far beyond what a simple phone call could resolve. As I passed through the aisles, I saw her again. Maya had stopped in front of the baby care section, holding a pack of diapers in her hands. It struck me how carefully she was choosing them, her small fingers tracing over the packages as if she knew exactly what she was looking for. It was a level of focus that made me pause. I moved closer, watching her struggle to peel a crumpled dollar bill from her pocket. She tried to flatten it out, but it looked hopelessly torn, with the edges fraying as she held it in her tiny hands. She took the bill to the register, where an older cashier stood, her expression stern but neutral. I approached cautiously, keeping a little distance. Maya tried to pay with the crumpled dollar, but the cashier just looked at her, then shook her head. "That's not enough, sweetie," the cashier said, her voice tinged with impatience. "You don't have enough to pay for these." Maya's face hardened. She didn't argue or plead. She simply stood there, looking up at the woman with a quiet determination. My heart sank as I watched her, this small, defenseless girl, standing alone in front of an adult who didn't seem to care at all. The cashier wasn't rude, but there was a coldness to her tone, a complete lack of empathy. I felt my anger rising again. How could someone see a child in need and not act? I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "I'll cover it," I said, my voice firm, though I was aware of the feeling of panic starting to settle in my stomach. "How much is it?" The cashier glanced up, a little surprised. She gave the total amount, and without a second thought, I handed her the money. I could feel Maya's eyes on me, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something like hope in her gaze. I didn't even know why I was doing it, but in that moment, it seemed like the only thing to do. I wasn't just buying diapers, I was buying a piece of trust. I was giving this girl something she needed, something that, for reasons I couldn't fathom, seemed impossible to get on her own. As I turned to hand Maya the diapers, I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for them. Her expression was one of disbelief, mixed with a sense of gratitude that was almost too much to bear. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She had been surviving on her own, without any real help, for far too long. I crouched down again to her level. "Are you sure your parents are coming for you?" I asked gently. Her silence spoke volumes. She didn't respond, but the absence of any reassurance made my stomach twist. This little girl was alone, and there was no one waiting for her at home. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was her reality. Her life wasn't just a moment of misfortune, it was a pattern of neglect, of being left behind. I stood up and glanced around the store, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what to do next. I couldn't let her go back to whatever life she had waiting for her. And yet, I had no idea what to do. My thoughts were clouded with uncertainty. Was it my place to intervene further? What if she didn't want my help? Or worse, what if someone else, someone far less kind than me, took notice? I looked back at her, and I could see the strain in her face. The quiet resilience was still there, but it was no match for the loneliness in her eyes. I knew that she needed more than just a pack of diapers and a stranger's kindness. She needed stability. She needed safety. "Come on, Maya," I said softly. "Let's get you out of here." But she didn't move. She just stood there, clutching the diapers to her chest, her small frame a symbol of everything I wanted to protect, but felt powerless to change. I couldn't just leave her there. The weight of the situation pressed on me, and with each passing second, my sense of responsibility deepened. This wasn't just about buying diapers for a child in need, it was about stepping into a life that had been neglected. A life where no one had bothered to step in before. I could see it in Maya's eyes. A quiet plea for help. A plea she had probably been making for so long. Without anyone answering, I knelt down again, trying to meet her gaze. "Maya, I really think we need to get you some help," I said gently, but firmly. "Do you want to come with me? I'll make sure you're safe." She hesitated, looking down at the diapers in her hands. Her fingers clutched them tightly, as if they were the only thing standing between her and an uncertain world. She shook her head slowly, her small voice barely audible when she spoke. "I don't need help. I'm fine." The words stung, but I knew they weren't meant to be harsh. It was her way of protecting herself, of putting up a wall against the world. She had learned, probably at a very young age, that trusting others could hurt, that asking for help could make things worse. My heart ached for her. She was just a little girl. And yet she had already been forced to bear the weight of the world in ways no child should. But I couldn't back down now. I had come too far. And in my heart, I knew this wasn't just a matter of giving her a ride home or making sure she wasn't alone in a store. This was about taking action. About making sure she wasn't left to face a world that had already shown her so much cruelty. I stood up and took a deep breath. Maya, I know you're scared. I understand. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm not going to leave you. She looked up at me then, her eyes wide and unsure, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the smallest trace of trust. I didn't know, but I had to take that chance. Come on, I said again, offering her my hand. Let's go talk to someone. They'll help you. This time, she didn't pull away. She didn't take my hand. But she stood up. The diapers still clutched tightly to her chest. I gently led her toward the front of the store, where I could see the cashier and a couple of other employees milling around. I was desperate to find someone who could take this seriously. Someone who would see Maya for what she was, a little girl who needed help. Not just a nuisance or a problem to be ignored. I didn't know what the next step was. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. But I knew I couldn't keep going around in circles. I had to act. And I had to act now. As we reached the front of the store, I noticed Jack standing behind the customer service desk, talking to another employee. He glanced up when we approached, his eyes flickering with recognition. But there was no change in his demeanor. He was still the same Jack who had shrugged off Maya's presence earlier. The same Jack who had seemed indifferent to her need for help. I walked up to him, my voice steady but insistent. Jack, I said. I need to speak to a manager. Now. Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. Sure thing, he said, his tone almost mocking. He turned away and called over his shoulder. Hey, Margaret. Can you come over here for a minute? A few moments later, a middle-aged woman came over, her expression tired but professional. She was the kind of person who had seen it all. Someone who was used to dealing with problems and moving on. But when she saw Maya standing next to me, her demeanor shifted slightly. There was a brief flicker of concern in her eyes. But it quickly vanished, replaced by an air of professionalism. What's the problem? Margaret asked, her voice flat. I took a deep breath. This little girl is alone in the store, I said, my voice tight with emotion. She needs help. She's been here for a while. And no one seems to be taking her situation seriously. Margaret glanced at Maya, then back at me, her expression unreadable. And what exactly do you want me to do about it? Her words were sharp, dismissive. But I pressed on. I want to make sure she gets home safely. I want to know that someone is going to help her. She can't be left alone like this. Margaret looked at Maya again, then at me, and I could see the slightest hesitation in her eyes. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she would take action. Maybe she would call the authorities or contact someone who could help. But then she spoke, her voice as cold as before. Well, I don't see what I can do. She's not our responsibility. The words hit me like a slap, and I could feel the anger rising in my chest. How could she be so callous? How could she dismiss the situation so easily? This wasn't just some inconvenience for her to brush aside. This was a child who needed someone to care. And no one here seemed to care. I looked at Maya, who stood quietly by my side, her small frame so full of vulnerability. I knew I couldn't rely on these people to do anything. I would have to take matters into my own hands. Fine, I said, my voice suddenly cold and firm. I'll take it from here. I turned to Maya, who still hadn't said a word, and I gently placed my hand on her shoulder. Let's go. Maya, I said softly. We're leaving. And with that, We walked out of the store, leaving behind the indifference and the coldness of a world that had let her down. As we stepped out of the store, the cool night air hit my face. And for the first time in what felt like hours, I took a deep breath. The fluorescent lights of the Walmart were gone, replaced by the dim glow of streetlights that lined the empty road ahead. But as much as the air felt like a welcome relief, a gnawing sense of unease followed me. Maya had barely spoken since we left the store, and the quiet weight of her presence beside me was both unsettling and heartbreaking. She hadn't resisted when I insisted on leaving, but I could tell that she was lost in her own world, a world that had been too harsh for a child her age to comprehend. I glanced down at her, unsure of what to say. She was still clutching the pack of diapers tightly, her eyes focused ahead, but distant. The silence between us felt heavy, like there were words hanging in the air that neither of us could speak. "Maya," I said softly, trying to break the silence. "Do you want to tell me where you live? I want to make sure you're safe." She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, she pointed ahead, a vague gesture toward a dimly lit street off to the side. "Over there," she said, her voice small, almost inaudible in the night air. I didn't want to push her, but I needed to know more. "Are your parents there? Your mom or dad?" She hesitated, and for a brief moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Her hand tightened around the diapers as if she were holding on to something she couldn't afford to lose. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "No, they're not there." The words hit me like a cold wave. I didn't ask for more details right away. It wasn't until we reached the street she had pointed to that I began to understand the gravity of what she had said. We turned down the alleyway, and there, at the end of the street, was a dilapidated building that looked more like an abandoned structure than a home. The paint was peeling, the windows grimy with neglect, and there was an air of desolation that seemed to cling to it. Maya led me to the door, and I watched her for a moment as she stood still, staring at the entrance like it was a place she didn't want to go but had no choice but to return to. I followed her to the door, unsure of what I would find. When she pushed it open, a wave of cold air hit me. Inside, the place was even worse than I had imagined. The furniture was sparse, if you could even call it that, and the room reeked of something stale and unclean. There were piles of old clothes and unwashed dishes stacked haphazardly around the small space. Maya didn't seem to notice the filth or the disarray. She moved quickly to the small couch in the corner, and I followed her. It was only then that I noticed her younger brother, Oliver, sitting on the floor near the couch. He was smaller than Maya, probably around 2 or 3 years old, with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that were far too tired for a child his age. I felt a pang of sorrow in my chest as I looked at them, 2 small children in a house that seemed to have forgotten the concept of warmth or care. Maya turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "This is where we live," she said, her voice so matter-of-fact that it almost broke my heart. I crouched down in front of her, my hands resting on my knees. "Maya," I said gently, "where's your mom and dad? They're supposed to take care of you." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she just stared at the floor, her small fingers picking at the frayed edge of the couch cushion. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quiet and distant. "Mom comes and goes. She goes out with men. Dad's not here anymore." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight, each one sinking deeper into my heart. I felt a sharp pang of anger at the neglect, the abandonment, and the cruel circumstances that these children had been forced to endure. A child should never have to say something like that, should never have to grow up in a place like this. The rawness of Maya's words, the way she had grown accustomed to the chaos, the absence of love or safety, was a hard pill to swallow. Oliver, who had been watching us silently, crawled over to Maya and climbed onto the couch beside her. Nestling against her side, she put an arm around him, her protective instinct kicking in, even though she was still just a child herself. I sat back on my heels, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on me. The idea of leaving them here, in this broken home, felt impossible. They were so young, so fragile. Maya had been forced to take on a role far beyond her years, looking after her brother, surviving without the protection or guidance of parents who were supposed to care for them. As I looked at the two of them, I realized that I couldn't just walk away. They needed someone. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt as though that someone had to be me. I knew the moment I stepped into that crumbling apartment that everything was about to change. I had walked into a story far bigger than I could have imagined. And it was now mine to rewrite. Maya and Oliver, two small children with no one to turn to, were trapped in a life that no child should ever know. And here I was, a stranger, faced with the heartbreaking reality that I could no longer pretend this wasn't my problem. 2. The weight of the decision settled heavily on me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Their needs were so basic, so urgent. They needed food, shelter, and love. The harsh reality of their situation was crushing. These children were forced to grow up too fast, learning to survive in an environment that had long since forgotten how to care for them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how little they had been given in life. Maya's face, so weary and full of resignation, had made it clear that they weren't just physically hungry, they were starving for stability, for safety, for someone who cared. I stood in the middle of the apartment, looking around at the disarray that surrounded us. The room was dark, with only a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were stained with age, and the windows were covered in dust. There was no warmth here, no sense of home, and as much as I could try to ignore it, I could feel the weight of the neglect pressing down on me like a physical force. Maya had told me about her mom's absence, about the men who came and went, and about her dad's disappearance. It was clear now that neither of them could provide for the children. And worse, it seemed they had long ago stopped trying. The thought of them being left to fend for themselves without any kind of stable adult presence made my stomach churn. I looked at the two kids, sitting on the couch with blank expressions on their faces. Maya was comforting Oliver, her younger brother, who had curled into her lap for warmth. She had taken on the role of caregiver, despite being just a little girl herself. My heart ached for them both. They had learned to survive in a world where no one was looking out for them. But I couldn't just sit back and let them continue down this path. "Hey," I said gently, kneeling beside the couch where Maya and Oliver were. Maya looked up at me, her eyes tired but somehow hopeful. "I'm going to help you," I promised her. "I'm going to take care of you and your brother. But I need to know, what do you need the most right now?" Maya's gaze flickered away from me for a moment, as if she was unsure of what to say. But then, without a word, she pointed at the small kitchen area. I walked over, my heart sinking further as I surveyed the mess. The kitchen was barely functional, there was no food in sight. Just empty shelves and a dirty countertop. There were a few cans in a corner, but they were unopened. And there was no way to prepare them. "I don't have anything for you to eat," Maya said quietly, as though it was the most normal thing in the world to not have food. "Mom didn't leave any money, and there's no food in the store." Her words were simple, but they cut straight through me. This was the reality they lived in every day. There was no stability, no safety, no consistency. How had they managed to survive on their own for this long? And how had no one noticed their struggle? I turned back to Maya, my mind racing. "Okay," I said, swallowing hard. "I'm going to get you food. I'm going to bring you everything you need." I wanted to say more, to promise that everything would be different now. But I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just about food, it was about giving them a future. A chance at a life they deserved. And that wasn't something I could fix with a trip to the grocery store. Maya's eyes softened. And for the first time since I met her, she smiled faintly. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to tell me that, in this moment, she believed me. "I'll be back soon." "Okay," I said. You're not alone anymore. I'm here. Maya nodded. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, a quiet, tentative hope in her eyes. And that was all I needed to keep going. I left the apartment with one clear mission in mind: to return with food, with supplies, and with a promise to these children that they wouldn't be abandoned again. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew I couldn't walk away from them now. I had already made my decision. This was just the beginning. As I stepped out of the apartment building, I took a deep breath, trying to shake the weight of what I had just seen. The grim reality of Maya and Oliver's life lingered in my mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. But I knew I couldn't dwell on the sadness. I had to act. The children needed me to make things better, to show them that someone cared, someone who wasn't going to abandon them like the rest of the world had. I made my way to the nearest grocery store, where I grabbed everything I thought they might need: bread, milk, fruits, some canned food, anything that would give them a little comfort. But as I filled my cart, something kept nagging at me. Food and basic supplies were essential. Yes. But they needed more than that. They needed warmth, safety, and a sense of hope. How could I give them that? When I returned to the apartment, Maya and Oliver were waiting just where I left them. Maya had been trying her best to take care of her younger brother, though her tired eyes made it clear that she had been running on empty for far too long. She had taken on a role she should never have had to bear. "Here you go," I said as I entered the small room, setting the bags of food down in front of them. Maya's eyes widened as she looked at the groceries. And for the first time, she looked like a child again. Her shoulders seemed to relax a little, and Oliver's face lit up when he saw the food. But it wasn't just the food that mattered, it was the unspoken message that came with it: someone cared. Maya reached out and slowly began unpacking the bags. She picked up a loaf of bread, and her fingers lingered on it, as if she were savoring the simple act of holding something that was hers. Her face softened. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were quiet, but they were powerful. It was a thank you that wasn't just for the food, it was a thank you for seeing them, for recognizing their humanity when everyone else had turned a blind eye. I knelt down beside them, watching as they began to pull the food out of the bags. Maya had already started dividing up the bread, tearing off pieces and handing them to Oliver, who eagerly accepted. It was such a small act, but it felt monumental in the moment. They were still children, still trying to hold on to whatever semblance of normalcy they could, despite the chaos that surrounded them. I stayed with them for a while, helping where I could. I watched as Maya tried to cook the canned food, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with the can opener. She was doing her best, but it was clear that she was exhausted, her little body fighting against the weight of a life that no child should ever have to live. After a while, Maya looked at me, her tired eyes meeting mine. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I'll take care of Oliver. We'll be fine." I smiled softly, though it was hard to hide the sadness that tugged at my heart. "Maya," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "you shouldn't have to take care of him. I'm here to help. I'm not going anywhere." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. I could see the vulnerability in her, the fear that at any moment, she might be left alone again, that whatever small comfort I had offered them would vanish as quickly as it had arrived. It was clear that she didn't know how to trust that I wouldn't leave, how to believe that someone would stick around for the long haul. "Why did you come back?" she asked, almost as if she were testing me. I paused, unsure of how to answer. It was a simple question, but one that carried so much weight. Why had I come back? Was it out of guilt? Out of compassion? Or was it something deeper? Something I wasn't fully ready to admit to myself? "I came back because you matter," I said quietly. "Because you and Oliver matter. You don't deserve to live like this." Her eyes searched mine, as if trying to find the truth in my words. I could see the conflict in her, the hesitation to let herself believe that someone would truly care. But there was something in her gaze that made me believe she wanted to trust me. She wanted to believe that someone, somewhere, would show her that the world wasn't as cold and indifferent as it seemed. I'm going to keep helping you, I added, my voice steady and sure. I promise. Maya didn't respond right away, but I could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe. It was enough. It was everything. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I didn't have all the answers. But I also knew that Maya and Oliver weren't alone anymore. And that, in itself, was a start. The night had already begun to settle in around the apartment. And as I sat with Maya and Oliver, the atmosphere in the room felt a little lighter than before. The food, small as it was, had brought a sense of relief, if only for a fleeting moment. But I knew this wasn't enough. There was still so much more that needed to be done. Their living conditions were beyond what I had anticipated. And even with the food I had brought, it didn't feel like a permanent solution. These kids needed stability, safety, and something beyond mere survival. They needed to feel like they were more than just the sum of their circumstances. But I also knew I couldn't change everything overnight. Not on my own. As I sat quietly on the couch, observing the children as they ate, I tried to think through my next steps. My mind kept going back to their mother, the woman who had left them in this pitiful state. Maya had told me her mother came and went, often disappearing for days at a time with various men. What kind of parent would let their children fend for themselves? It made no sense. But there was a growing anger in me. An anger I wasn't sure what to do with. As the evening wore on, I decided to take a walk outside, trying to clear my head. I needed to think. The apartment felt claustrophobic, and I had to get away from it for a moment. I could hear Maya and Oliver talking quietly inside as I stepped into the hallway. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a sense of peace. I was doing something. I was helping them. But when I returned a short time later, I walked straight into a nightmare. The door to the apartment was slightly ajar, and I could hear raised voices coming from inside. I pushed it open cautiously, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Maya's mother was there, standing by the doorway, swaying slightly, her face flushed and her eyes glazed. She was drunk. Clearly. Her movements erratic and unpredictable. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize. His eyes hard. His demeanor cold. "Maya, what are you doing?" the woman slurred, her voice thick with alcohol. "Who's this? Who's been feeding you?" Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Maya was standing there, her small form frozen, her eyes wide with fear. Oliver had curled up on the couch, his little face hidden in his hands, trying to block out the chaos. The scene before me felt surreal. This was supposed to be a safe place, a home. But there was nothing safe here. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I stepped forward, my voice firm as I addressed the woman. "You're drunk," I said, keeping my tone calm but resolute. "And this is no place for your children." She narrowed her eyes at me, her expression shifting from confusion to hostility. "What do you know about my kids?" she spat, taking a step toward me, her body swaying dangerously. "Stay out of it. They're fine. They don't need you." I could feel my anger rising. But I knew this wasn't the time to lose control. Maya and Oliver were watching, and I had to be careful. I couldn't let the situation escalate into something worse. The man beside her spoke up, his voice gruff and unfeeling. "She's right. Mind your business, pal. This is none of your concern." But it was my concern. It was my responsibility now. I wasn't going to let these kids stay in this environment for one more second. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Maya," I called gently, stepping toward her. "Come here. Now." She didn't move at first, her body trembling slightly, but when she looked at me, there was something in her gaze that told me she wanted to leave. She wanted to be free from the turmoil, from the terror of living in a place like this. Slowly, she walked over to me, her small hand reaching for mine. I could feel the weight of everything she had been through in that one touch. The years of neglect, of pain, of abandonment. "Let's go," I said, my voice steady, as I guided her toward the door. "You and Oliver are coming with me." Her mother let out a bitter laugh. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had no time for her. No time for her broken promises or her excuses. All that mattered in that moment were the children, Maya and Oliver. And as I guided them toward safety, I knew there was no turning back. I stepped into the night, with Maya and Oliver in tow, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a fierce protectiveness for them both. I had made a promise, and I was going to keep it, no matter what. The road ahead was unclear. But one thing was certain: these kids would never have to face another night like this again. As I walked away from the apartment building, Maya and Oliver close by my side, a new chapter had already begun. But I knew this was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. I couldn't undo what had already been done to them. But I could try to give them something they hadn't had for a long time: a sense of safety, stability, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of joy. They had already been through more than any child should bear. And now it was my responsibility to help them rebuild what had been broken. We didn't talk much as we walked. Maya was unusually quiet, her eyes darting nervously as she glanced up at me every now and then. I could tell she was unsure of where this was going, unsure of me. Her trust had been shattered long ago, and I knew I had to earn it, little by little. Oliver, on the other hand, clung to Maya's side, his tiny hand holding onto her sleeve. I could see the anxiety in his eyes, his world turned upside down by the strangers and the uncertainty that had suddenly engulfed him. But at least, for now, they were safe. At least, for now, they were together. We walked to my car, and I could feel Maya's hesitation. She wasn't used to adults helping her, especially not in such a direct way. She had learned, all too young, to distrust the kindness of strangers. I could see the walls she had built around herself. Walls that I would have to tear down slowly, carefully. She wasn't going to trust me overnight, and I didn't expect her to. But I would prove to her, day by day, that I could be someone she could rely on. As we drove to my apartment, the silence lingered in the car. Maya and Oliver were exhausted, and I could see the weight of their lives pressing down on them. Even as they tried to process what had just happened, they were still in shock, their small minds trying to make sense of the fact that someone was actually stepping in to help. But there was also a sense of relief in their expressions, a quiet gratitude that they didn't quite know how to express yet. They had been given a chance that they hadn't expected, a chance that they thought had been lost long ago. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I showed them to the guest room, which was simple but clean and welcoming. I told Maya and Oliver that they could stay here for as long as they needed. I promised them that I wouldn't leave. I made them a meal, a small one, but enough to fill their bellies, and as they sat at the table, eating in silence, I found myself watching them with a mixture of awe and sadness. It wasn't just the fact that they were so young and had already experienced so much pain, it was also the resilience they displayed in the face of it all. Maya, despite everything, had managed to care for her brother. She had kept him safe, even when she was so lost herself. Oliver, despite his fear, had trusted his sister, had clung to her in the only way he knew how. They were two small people, carrying the weight of a world that had forgotten them. Yet somehow, they had managed to hold on to each other. As I sat across from them, watching them eat, a sense of determination rose within me. I had made a commitment to them, a commitment that went beyond providing food or shelter. I wasn't just going to offer them a temporary reprieve from their troubles. I was going to be the person who helped them build a new future, one where they were no longer the victims of their circumstances, but the architects of their own lives. And that meant going beyond the immediate needs: food, clothing, a safe place to sleep. It meant finding a way to address the deeper issues that had led them to this point. Maya and Oliver weren't just children without parents. They were children who had been failed by the system, by the people who were supposed to protect them. And I knew that if I wanted to truly make a difference in their lives, I would need to do more than just act as a temporary savior. I had to be a permanent fixture in their lives. Someone who would fight for them, who would advocate for them, who would help them rebuild. The night stretched on, and as Maya and Oliver settled into bed, I stood by the window, looking out at the city below. I thought about everything I had seen, everything I had learned in such a short amount of time. The injustice, the heartbreak, the neglect, it all weighed heavily on me. But there was also something else: hope. Hope for Maya and Oliver. And hope for me, too. Maybe I couldn't change the past, but I could change the future. As I turned away from the window, I felt a deep resolve settle in my chest. I was no longer just a bystander. I was part of their story now, and I was going to make sure it had a happy ending.